everyone. This is Sierra Hatfield, Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments headquarters here in Lexington, Kentucky. I staff the Smart Government Subcommittee of CSG's Future of Work National Task Force. The Smart Government Subcommittee is researching how state governments can implement new technologies for better service delivery without losing the human element that defines public work. I'm here today with Tracy Gruber, Director of the Office of Child Care and Senior Advisor for the Intergenerational Poverty Initiative, to help answer that first question. Tracy's professional career has been focused on achieving positive results for families. She is an outcome-focused leader committed to the use of data and continuous improvement to ensure there are intergenerational pathways to opportunity for Utah children. Prior to joining the Department of Workforce Services, Tracy worked at Voices for Utah Children as a Senior Policy Analyst and Director of State Fiscal Policy. In that capacity, she researched fiscal policy and economic policy, as well as strategies to reduce poverty, including two-generation approaches for families that achieve positive outcomes for parents and children. I'm going to give her free rein to talk about how Utah is handling intergenerational poverty, how they started, and what's come of it so far. So if that sounds good to you, Tracy, I'd like to start by asking, what is intergenerational poverty?
Well, thank you so much, Sierra, for having me to provide us the opportunity to talk about Utah's intergenerational poverty initiative. Utah is unique that it does have a definition in state law of what is intergenerational poverty, and it is defined as poverty in which two or more successive generations of a family continue in the cycle of poverty. And that's measured through utilization of public assistance, in which an adult has used public assistance for at least 12 months as an adult and at least 12 months as a child.
Okay. So what is this initiative that's looking to kind of handle this issue?
So the initiative was started by the Utah legislature back in 2012. And it started with a theory by a lawmaker up in Ogden, which is a community north of Salt Lake City, in which he, in his ecclesiastical role, was seeing a large number of children living in poverty. And this presented an opportunity for him to put forward a theory that he thought there are some families that are living in poverty that is passed from one generation to the next and therefore intergenerational, and other families that it is not passed on from one generation to the next. And he asked our department, the Utah Department of Workforce Services, to look at our data and utilize data regarding public assistance to evaluate whether or not Utah had a challenge with a certain part of its population living in the cycle of poverty. And he required our department to analyze that data and then presented that to the Utah legislature in 2012 to get it formally adopted in state law, that every year our department would look at this issue of intergenerational poverty and study it. And then in 2013, that legislation got amended and added onto, and it established what we call the Intergenerational Welfare Reform Commission, which I'll talk a little bit about, the agencies that are involved in that, as well as the Intergenerational Poverty Advisory Committee. And through that work, there is a 5- and 10-year plan with the goal of reducing intergenerational poverty among Utah children and decrease that utilization of public assistance to put them on a pathway to self-reliance into their adulthood.
Okay. So tell me a little bit more about this advisory committee.
So it's interesting. The complexity of intergenerational poverty leads to families utilizing resources and being involved in governmental programs across multiple state agencies. I don't think that that's really unique to Utah, that there are multiple state agencies that are interacting with families. I think in most states there's multiple state agencies involved. And because of that complexity and the fact that these families are going to various governmental entities to receive services and obtain resources, the Welfare Reform Commission that's established in our law requires the involvement of our agency, the Utah Department of Workforce Services, which oversees the bulk of the safety net programs. It also requires the involvement of the Utah Department of Human Services, which has multiple state agencies, including substance abuse and mental health, and child welfare, and juvenile justice, among others. The Utah State Board of Education, the Utah Department of Health, which oversees all of our public health programs, and then Utah's juvenile courts. And through the work of the Welfare Reform Commission, which has representatives, the executive directors actually, in many cases who are cabinet level officials, as members of the Welfare Reform Commission, responsible for looking at the data that we produce every year in our annual report. And then that informs the 5- and 10-year plan to reduce intergenerational poverty among Utah children.
Okay, so that's kind of what I'm looking for. Can you tell us a little bit more about how these agencies work together? And I assume that there's a lot of data sharing that must go on too.
Yes, yes, there is. The Intergenerational Poverty Initiative by law is very much centered around data and data-driven policymaking. And if you're going to have data-driven policymaking and use research in order to inform policies and procedures and maybe even departmental level rules, you really need to be able to access the data. And that's really what makes this initiative, I would say, pretty unique nationally, is that through data sharing agreements, all of these agencies that make up the Welfare Reform Commission are exchanging data of the families and the children who are experiencing intergenerational poverty in order to analyze and evaluate not just the barriers and challenges that these families and these children are experiencing as a result of living in intergenerational poverty, but also any bright spots that might be occurring in their families. There's a lot of assumptions that are often made about people living in poverty, but if the data is not validating those assumptions or those stereotypes, then there might not be a necessary policy solution to a certain challenge that we think is going on in these families' lives. So getting access to the data, sharing that data across multiple agencies that always have different data systems, but utilizing that data is really the most important component of this initiative, and it informs everything that the Welfare Reform Commission does.
So something that our subcommittee is kind of looking at is how state governments can start working to foster this idea of breaking down data silos and fostering a culture that promotes, safe and secure data sharing. So can you speak a little bit to how Utah has really become kind of like an epicenter, kind of like a beacon for, promoting this culture of data sharing?
Yeah, it hasn't been easy. And the first time there was data sharing for this initiative, it took a couple of years, starting with the need to have MOUs that talk about data security, how the transferring of the data was going to be done, how the data was going to be utilized. That was incredibly important. And I just would also say that before you can even get to the MOU part of this, you really needed to have buy-in. You need to have buy-in of the leadership of these agencies who have a commitment of working through these types of challenges with data sharing, which is not just kind of the technical aspect, which I can't even speak to because that's not within my skill set, but not just the technical challenges, but also the legal challenges that arise from sharing data about families. So you need to have that buy-in from the leadership level. Then we went through the MOU process, and then there were also growing pains associated with our agency, Workforce Services, which had responsibility or has responsibility for putting together those annual reports in some real, I don't want to say extreme trepidation, but some real nervousness around how our agency is going to report on something like child welfare, which is not one of our subject areas. There was a desire to make sure that if we were reporting on some of these sensitive subjects, that we were reporting it in an appropriate way. So not only just the data sharing through the MOU, having to work out those details, but also the process of how are you communicating about the data that is being shared. So once you got the leadership and you got the MOUs in place, then there's kind of the technical aspects, what needs to be in the data so that other entities can match on individuals when we're all using kind of different identifiers. And I know from talking to other states that not every state has the level of technology in place that even would allow them to say match on name, date of birth, and address, those types of characteristics of an individual. So that's probably something in some of our other states you would need to overcome. Fortunately, in Utah, even though we don't all use the same identifiers across state government, all of our agencies had a level of sophistication in their data systems that allowed each of us to kind of do a matching query to make sure that the data that we were reporting on, the aggregated data that we were reporting on, was reflective of the population as a whole, and we had a valid number of percentage of matches in our records in order to draw conclusions from the data.
Okay. My next question is, so we've talked a little bit about, data sharing and kind of like at the state level, but I'm a little curious, is there any engagement at, kind of smaller levels like county or community levels?
Yeah, there is actually, and I think it's important to note that the data sharing that we do and we're reporting on is aggregated data. So although we are sharing information with our other agencies, that data isn't used at the individual level. So it's de-identified data. And it's the same way that we are engaging with our local communities. We are able to disaggregate most of our data at the county level. In some cases, we can even disaggregate it at the zip code level, which means that we're able to provide our counties with valid data so that they know what's going on in their counties, and maybe at the local level, what policies and even potential investments they want to be making if they want to be involved in reducing intergenerational poverty at the county level. Because like every state, Utah is very different from one county to the next. The data shows up very differently in each county. So although we're not giving the counties the names of individuals, and they could potentially, like, if they had the individual names, go out and reach out to specific people, they do have aggregated data that's specific to their area so that they at the local level can figure out what type of plan they want to have in place to play a role in meeting the state's goal of reducing intergenerational poverty.
Okay, so this sounds almost like a mapping kind of technology that was kind of championed by the state, created by the state, but, the people with their boots on the ground that's actually using this data are people in those communities. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think we're using it at the state level for the things that the state really can control and be involved in, and they're using it at the local level on those issues that are really guided by local leadership.
Okay. So can you tell me any maybe successes or challenges that have come out of the initiative so far?
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of success in terms of the number and programs that aren't necessarily specific to intergenerational poverty, but are influencing the 5 and 10-year goals. I think what's relevant for this conversation is that obviously there's been much improved collaboration between not just at the state level, but at the local level for coordination of services to avoid duplication of efforts across state government. I still think that there's lots of room for improvement there, but we're moving in the right direction, not just for a government efficiency standpoint in coordinating and collaborating on services, but also for efficiencies for the families that are utilizing resources across multiple state agencies. There's also very clearly better strategic decisions that are being made, given the amount of data that's being shared across state agencies, and really getting a handle, as I said, on what is actually going on and where are their challenges and where are their strengths, and making sure that resources are put into the strategies and in the geographic areas where the need is highest, is greatest, and that's all through the use of data. When it comes down to taking all of that data and utilizing those data for policy improvement and resource targeting, that then leads to better outcomes for the kids and the families. And we're already seeing tremendous improvement in high school graduation rates among the children experiencing intergenerational poverty. So that's been, what we're ultimately talking about is improving lives of families in Utah. So that's a great improvement. And we've also seen, since this all started, when we look at the family structure, improvements in increases in wages and rates of employment amongst the intergenerational poverty population. So those are some real concrete successes that we've seen. In terms of lessons learned, especially when we're talking about data, data can often, if you use it too much without hearing from people directly impacted, it can sometimes oversimplify a complex problem. So you have to be kind of cautious about how you're using the data and the conclusions that you're drawing from the data. It also makes it depersonalizes. So it tends to ignore individuals and their experiences, which I also think is, that's a challenge, and it's something that you need to be conscious of if you're such a data-driven effort. Also, no data is perfect. I mean, I think that you have to use the data that you have in order to just get started. And if there's one thing I would say to states that are thinking about this, don't be too obsessed about having the perfect data. Just look at what you have access to and start moving the work forward that way without overthinking or trying to wait until the perfect data comes, because it's almost never going to arrive. And then I also think that we have serious challenges when we're data sharing with privacy laws. Of course, it's really important that we protect individuals who are utilizing state resources, but we constantly butt up against federal and state privacy laws that can limit the ability to have even greater information and greater impact on these families, and trying to work through that from a legal perspective is a pretty significant challenge that we've encountered and that I am aware that other states have encountered too. It's not insurmountable, but it is something that pops up whenever these types of data issues and data sharing issues present themselves, and you just have to be prepared for it. And again, if you have the leadership that's invested in it and they want to do the data sharing and we want to serve families in that type of coordinated way, working through some of those challenges is possible, but it is real.
Right, and I think those are all excellent points to make, especially your point about how sometimes when you have all of this data, even if it's not perfect, you know, it can just be useful. It can be easy to kind of cause that data kind of depersonalize or maybe desensitize someone, because at the end of the day, you know, this data, it just looks like numbers on a screen, but that's, you know, there's people behind it. Like, people are being affected by this issue.
Yes, and the way to kind of overcome that is to make sure that the initiative itself is rooted in the population that you're trying to support, so that you're connected, you have real stories to see is the data that you, is the conclusion that you're drawing from the data presenting itself on the ground with these families. And if it's not, maybe going back and looking at the data that you're pulling, or also making adjustments based on what you're hearing of the real experiences of the families. So in terms of the policy making and the telling of the stories and figuring out what actually works, it's also really important to make sure that you're circling back to the population that you're serving to see if it is in fact working, and having those real stories to complement the data.
Right. So I think that that's all of the questions I had for you. If you have anything else you'd like to say to the Smart Government Subcommittee or our other listeners about other things happening in Utah with this intergenerational poverty initiative, or any final thoughts about how a government can be smarter for its citizens?
I just think that in general, to the extent that states can start moving to get some of the data sharing together, and then, you know, making sure that you're properly communicating about what that data is showing in order to tell a story, and use government resources more efficiently and effectively through the use of the data. I think that not only does that help the states, but it also really makes progress for the families, and that's so incredibly important in terms of making sure that everybody who can be engaged in a state's economy are engaged. So not overlooking the importance of that data, effective messaging around it, in order to really channel those government resources is an effort that all states can and should be making.
Right, because especially with an issue as big as intergenerational poverty, no one agency is going to be able to collect that much data, analyze that much data, and really make a meaningful impact. It needs to be, you know, a collaborative effort.
Very true. Exactly.
All right. Well, Tracy, thank you so much for talking to us today, and I look forward to working with you again in the future.